Hello Unity developer, and in this one I'm going to show you how you can use XR Interaction Toolkit to make some interactable VR switches. Let's dive right in. So in order to make this tutorial a little bit more engaging, I decided to make a 3D model, and that 3D model is inspired by the Room VR, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. Alrighty, so here we are in VR. I've got my hands from my previous tutorials, and they're all set up as per those. But to be honest, as long as you've got your direct interactors attached to some object on your hands that's being tracked, then that's okay. You don't specifically need hands in order to make this work. Well, I'll go through the hierarchy with you in a minute and show you what's going on. But what we're going to be looking at making is something where you can grab a switch and then turn it and then have that interact in the world. So as you can see, starting at 0 here, and as I turn, the light's getting brighter and brighter and brighter. I can turn it all the way around until it goes off again. So you could put some tolerances on that and clamp the ranges, but this just shows you how you grab an object and then have that affect something in the virtual world. This one's not all set up yet. This is just done as an example just to show you. But this could just as easily be a puzzle. So let's say, for instance, that this light you had to get a certain intensity and then match it with this light to get a certain intensity, which then maybe unlocks the next part of the puzzle. So that's how I see something like this working, and very much inspired by games like the Room VR, which is absolutely amazing. So let's have a look at the hierarchy and see how all this is put together. Great, so now that we've seen that working and we know that everything's good to go, let's run through my hierarchy and I'll show you what's going on with this switch box. So all I've got here is a very simple scene. I've got my directional light, which is just set to real time. I've got my XR subsystems, which that's my naming, makes it sound important. But all that is my XR interaction manager, which contains the input action manager, activating all the inputs. A locomotion system so I can teleport around and turn as well and snap. And my trusty old XR rig, which is carried over from my previous tutorial, so it contains all the interactions for teleporting that I did in my teleporting tutorial. But as I said, as long as you've got inside your XR rig on your hands a direct interactor, then everything is set up and good to go. And don't forget your sphere collider, which is a trigger. So that's the XR side of everything. I then have my plane on the ground, a reflection probe, casting some reflections to make my materials look nice and shiny. And then last but not least, I also have my switch box puzzle. So I'm going to go ahead and isolate that selection. I think it's Shift, Control and H. No, Shift and H. Boom. Shift and H for isolate view if you didn't know that. Top tips. And let's have a look how this is set up. So on my switch, I just have its parent object, which is just an empty game object called switch box puzzle. And one thing to note here is that the rotation of all of these things is very important. Making sure we've got the x-axis pointing forward. And then the scale is all set to 1. And inside my switchbox puzzle, I have 3 things. I have a dial controller for the right, which contains all the stuff we need to enable the interaction. And all that really is just an empty game object with some components on it, a box collider, rigid body, and XR grab interactable as standard. So if you want to make a grab interactable, you always need those 3 things. With some caveats on the XR grab interactable, I have turned some stuff off. When we grab it, we don't want it to follow the controller around. We need it to stay where it is. So in order to do that, the retrain transform parent is unchecked. So is track position, track rotation, and throw and detach have all been unchecked. And my rigid body is set to is kinematic. And then this is what makes the magic happen, is the rotator script. And then that's looking for a couple of game objects in the hierarchy. It's looking for the dial joint. And we're not using physics, it's just called, the game object is just called the dial joint. And inside, this is my artwork for the switch box. I've got the bulb glass, this is just all meshes. But I have this dial joint right, and this is the actual handle that we're going to be able to turn. And you can see it here, I can select it and then turn it around. This is the object that needs to turn when we grab our interactor. So that's why it's connected up here in my rotator. When we try and grab hold of our dial controller on our XR grab interactable, it's going to be tracking the controller and then rotating that handle accordingly. So don't worry about the complexity of all this. It literally is just different parts of the mesh. All the magic really happens in the dial controller. And then once I've hooked up my rotator, what needs to rotate to the link dial, it then calls a method in whatever script you want to write. In my instance, it's called light control. So it's passing my light control a float value, which is then controlling the intensity of my light materials and a light that I have here. So as I turn the dial, all that's happening is my intensity is starting to go up and up and up and up and up. So that's how I put together this object. In a moment, I'm going to show you how we can just do a very simple quick object and how you can set it up from scratch. But before we do that, let's dive into the rotator script and really get under the hood of what's going on. So here we are in Visual Studio. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger just so you can see it a little easier on your screen. So the first thing we've got is the namespaces at the top, all standard stuff apart from we're using Unity Engine XR.interaction toolkit. And then I put this script inside a namespace just for separating out my code and keeping it all organized. Then we move down to declaring the class, and then we have some variables just here. And these are all private variables and they're all serialized so we can see them in the inspector. And the first variable we've got here is the link dial. And as I spoke about earlier, this is the 3D objects that we're going to be rotating. And below there, we have a private int, which is the snap rotation amount. Should be amount. Hang on, let's change that while we're here. Put an N in. Right click, quick, and rename. Boom. The snap rotation amount is how much the dial rotates when you move your hand. So it's going to go in 25-degree increments. And then below there, we have a float, which is the angle the angle tolerance, and now this is linked to the rotation of the hand, the actual controller. The tolerance is just how much you have to move your hand in order to turn the dial, and these two are quite linked. It's quite important. And then we have the game objects for our right hand model and our left hand model, which we haven't seen yet in my little demo, but I'll explain how those are used later on. And then there's a ball just below, should use dummy hands, which is these three are all linked as well. And I'll explain more about that when we get to it. Then we have a private XR base interactor, and this is going to be the interactor from your hand that it's getting a hold of. And then we have a float, which is the start angle, and the start angle is just keeping a reference of when we release a grab and then go back on to touch the dial or grab the dial, it records what angle the dial is at before we move it. And then we have a ball to determine whether we require the start angle or not, and a ball if we should get the hand rotation. And by default, these are set to true and false. And then lastly, for our variables, we have the XR grab interactable, and we're doing a simple get component on here, and to get hold of the grab interactable on this game object that the rotator sits alongside. And then on enable, we're listening to the grab interactor's select entered events. So on our grab interactable, when we grab it, it will fire this event called select entered. And this is all part of the XR grab interactable script, those events. So we're listening to those. And the second this event is detected, it fires the grabbed by method, which is just below. So it's adding some listeners on enable, and it's disabling those listeners when we finish. So let's have a look at the grabbed by method, which is just here. So when we grab our dial, when we grab that grab interactable, first thing that's going to happen is that we're going to assign our interactor. And to do that, we're going to access the grab interactable, and we're going to get hold of that grab interactable's selecting interactor. So once you grab hold of something in your scene, the thing that you grab knows what interactor has grabbed it, what hand has grabbed that. Quite important. And then on that interactor, we are setting the hide controller on select to true, because the way that I've set up some of the hand systems, when we're showing hand models holding on to the dial handle, we want to turn off our current controller on our XR rig if it isn't already marked as true. And then we set should get hand rotation to true. We set our start angle to 0 and our hand model visibility to true. So once should hand rotation get set to true, in our update method, you'll see here we have an if statement. It's checking should get hand rotation, And the second this goes to true, it starts listening to the interactor rotation. And for that, it stores it in a variable here called rotation angle. And it fires a method called get interactor rotation. And that's a very simple method just below. All it's doing is getting the current rotation of our controller. And it passes that back. And then it fires the method get rotation distance, passing it the rotation angle of our controller. And then a little bit of maths happens. And so brace yourself, this might sting a little. I'm going to have to try and remember this. So the very first thing that happens to determine the angle is that it needs to know where it started from and what its current angle is. And then it returns the difference using the mathf.absolute or ABS. And it stores that angle difference in this variable here. So let's say our start angle is 0 and our current angle is 45 degrees. Then that difference of 45 degrees is going to get stored in angle difference. And then if the angle difference is greater than the angle tolerance, so has our hand moved enough or rotated enough to enable the dial to turn? In this case, it has. Let's just say that, for instance, the angle tolerance was 10 degrees. If our hand is rotated more than 10 degrees, and that's checked in out by our angle difference, then we can rotate. But there's a couple of things we need to check once we have rotated. At the moment, the way that the dial works is that you could turn the dial to the left still, and that will go from 0 to 360, which would appear as quite a big movement, but it's actually only tiny. So we need to check for those different things. And we also need to check whether we're rotating the dial clockwise or if we're rotating the dial anti-clockwise. And all that craziness is done in here. And it looks a lot worse than it is. And all we're simply doing is we're comparing the start angle to the current angle, and if one is greater than the other, then that is a way of working out whether we're rotating clockwise or whether we're rotating anti-clockwise. And we do a quick angle check, and that fires the check angle method, which is down here, and it just returns a float, and it's going to take the current angle, the start angle, and do some maths and return the value. If our angle check here is greater than our angle tolerance, it's going to go down to our else statement and it's going to rotate the dial clockwise after it's done all of its angle checks. And rotate dial clockwise, it's just down here. And this is where we actually turn the physical dial. You can see here we have the snap rotation amount, so that's what we're incrementing it by. That's quite a long line. I don't always like the long lines, but you could drop it down here and tab it across, and this will make it easier to read. There you go, that might be easier for you to see what's going on there. So then once we've rotated our game object round, we're then going to carry out an if statement, and we're going to use the try get component. And that's going to try and get the component on the current game object of IDial. Now IDial is an interface that you can use to build your own scripts from and inherit from IDial to allow you to create your own custom functionality, and I'll show you how I've used that in a second. But essentially it looks for this interface and then it passes out the rotation amount as a value. So then we can do some cool stuff for our game. And the rotate dial anti-clockwise is actually very, very similar. It's literally the same. It just goes the other way. Duh. So let's have a quick look at this IDial. So how can we use this rotator script to create our own custom functionality? It's all done through this interface called IDial. Let's have a look at that. So in my dial scripts folder here, you can see I've got the interface IDial, and this will be very simple. Not an awful lot going on. We've just created a public interface called IDial. All we're doing is creating this method called dial changed, and we're passing it the dial value, which we're doing in our rotator script here. See, passing this float. So how do we use that interface? Well, if you're not familiar with interfaces, you can write a script. I've got one here called light control, and all you have to do is inherit from IDial. And when you do that, you'll be prompted to create a method. You'll probably get like a red squiggly line, and you can click on it and it will say generate methods or something. And then you can see here I've got my dial changed method, which is in IDial. So it's forcing us to use this method, and it's passing us that float value from our rotator script, and then we're able to manipulate certain elements of our game. And you can see here I'm working out some percentages that controls the light intensity and the light material emission. So as I crank up the dial, my light's getting brighter, and also my material emission is getting brighter or darker depending on how I've rotated the dial. But as long as you are inheriting from this and you've got your dial changed and you're getting in your float value, then you can do whatever you want. Let's say we were passing through a dial value and we needed to get to a value of say 90 degrees, and then as soon as that value is read in here, it opens like a door or sets off an alarm or something like that. It could be literally anything. So now I've explained how those scripts communicate with one another, let's have a go at building a very simple switch. Okay, let's have a look at creating a very simple dial. You can see how all these scripts work together. So we've got our dial here we were playing around with and controlling the value of the light. Let's go ahead and make our own one. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead, and you'll do this too. Before you drag in any artwork, if you've got your own switches or whatever, right click and go to create empty. It's going to put an empty game object in your scene. Let's call this switch, and then we'll make sure it's at 0, 0, 0, like so. To make this easier to see, I'm going to turn off my floor, and I've lost it. And this can be the parent object of our switch. And then on our switch, we're going to add some components. We're going to add the XR grab interactable, and then that's going to put a rigid body on here, and it's also going to put the XR grab interactable on top. On our rigid body, there's a couple of settings we need to change. I want to uncheck use gravity and check is kinematic. And now what is quite important is to uncheck some things on our XR grab interactable. We want to uncheck retain transform of the parent. We want to uncheck track position and uncheck track rotation, and we don't want to throw it on detach. This switch is designed to be static, like it's stuck to the wall or on a pipe or whatever, and not designed to be moved. All this is doing is looking for that grab on the lever and then twisting the hand. And then on this object, you want to go ahead and add in our rotator script. So you can type it in like so, or you can navigate to wherever you've downloaded it from. Mine's in my scripts under dials, and I can put my rotator script onto my switch. So then you would have the rigid body, XR grab interactable, and your rotator. Now we won't fill these in just for a minute. Just know that our rotator script is on there, and this is all set up and good to go. So now we've got all these components on our switch, we can go ahead and have a look at our artwork. Go ahead and right click, we'll go to 3D objects, and we'll create a cube. This is going to be our artwork. So we can say artwork. And now this is going to be the thing the switch sits on, kind of like the artwork. So we could just call this switch housing or whatever. It's just art, and then we'll make it like a little panel. So we'll go 1.2, 0.2, and then about 0.1, 0.05. There we go. Getting fussy now. So that's just like the switch thing, the switch housing. So the switch is going to sit on front of here. This is just artwork, so we don't need a collider for this. We can go ahead and remove that. Next up, we're going to make the collider that's going to detect our hand. So what we'll do is we'll click on the switch housing, duplicate it by going Control D, and then rename it Switch Collider. And then if you add a component to this, called the box collider, and then we can remove everything else. So we don't need the mesh filter, and we don't need the mesh renderer. All we got on here is a collider, and then we can move it into position. So we're going to make it a little bit bigger. And all that's going to happen is this is the collider that's just going to detect when our hand is able to grab the object. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping here and just move my switch collider to the top. Now we just need to finish this off by creating the actual switch. So again, I'm going to duplicate my switch housing. It's in the right place and I don't have to fuss around moving it too much. I'm going to bring it forward, and then I'm just going to call this one dial and resize it down. So let's go like that and like that. And then again, I'm going to duplicate that one, move it up a touch, make it smaller, and have it pointing out the top, just so we know that it's rotating and we can see which way we're orientated with the switch. I'm going to put some any old materials on here. Let's just use a black material. That's not black. Make that material black, and let's do the top green. Snazzy. One thing that's important to note is that anything we want rotating with our dial art needs to be all one object. So I'm going to put that top little nubbin inside my dial. So I've got a whole dial like that, so that when it rotates, it's all going to go like this. And don't forget, your orientation is going to be very important, so make sure you're on local. If you're using your own artwork, you need to make sure that the blue, the Z-axis is forward and it's pointing this way, and Y is up, and make sure you're in locus, you won't see the right result. Else, when you go ahead and try and rotate your own artwork, it could be going in all sorts of directions. So just confirm that you're in the right orientations. Okay, now when we've got that all set up, if you go back to your switch where you have the rotator, now we can hook it all up. So we're going to put our linked dial here, this transform. That's the dial artwork that we want to turn. So we'll drop in our dial transform just there. And let's make the rotation. The rotation amount is fine at 25 degrees. Now the angle tolerance, remember, is how much we have to move our hand in order to in order to make the dial rotate. So if we only want it to rotate once our hand's gone quite a distance because of sensitivity issues or something, then we could crank this up to like 90 degrees. So the hand would have to go 90 before the dial rotates 25. So let's say we only want to rotate our hand 20 degrees before the dial rotates 25 degrees. And the right hand model and the left hand model, I'm going to leave blank for the moment, but this is all you really need to get dials up and running. I can show you what I mean by these hand models in a second. One last thing before we test this out is the colliders. We need to tell our grab interactable what collider it's going to be using. So we're going to put a 1 in the collider box, and we're going to drag in our switch collider like so. Now setting it up like this is actually very useful because we've removed any linkage from our artwork, because what we've done is you could just drop in your switch housing. This is just art, it could be anything. There's no code associated with the switch housing, so you could just put your own art in there, move it into position, and then you can do the same thing with the dial. You can just create an empty position, and as long as it's got the dial inside of it, so you can just drop in your dial art, the thing that you're turning inside here, and then you're all good to go and all set. Let's test this out. I've moved my switch into position just by dragging it up so I can actually access it really easily. In fact, I'm going to put it over my current dial so it's right in front of me. Now let's hop in to the world of VR and see if this is all working. So if you follow along, hopefully you've understood it. Let's test it out. It should be good. So we've got my original switches here. And here's the new one we set up. So there we go, you can see it turning. Its rotation is tracking my controller, and it's using that angle tolerance to determine whether or not to rotate the dial. So you see I can rotate my hand a little bit. You might not be able to see that actually, hang on. So I rotate my hand around, it's not doing it until I reach the angle tolerance, and then it's going to start to turn. Very cool, and that works with both hands, so left or right. That is how you set up a switch. So I'll make this prefab available to people along with the script so you can test it out for yourself and see how it's all put together. But next up, one last feature that I wanted to show you, and that was the right hand and the left hand models and should use dummy hands. Let's have a look at that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this switch. In fact, I'm going to create a prefab of that switch so I don't lose it later on, and then remove it from the scene. Now the rotator script has the functionality to turn on your hand so you can see it grabbed on to the grab interactor and as if it was actually holding on to it properly. So the way I'm going to show you to do that is relatively simple, and it's kind of hacky, I suppose. It's not using your actual VR hand, it's just using a model of your VR hand in place, but it's detecting whether you've grabbed it with your right hand or your left hand. So it looks like as your controller switches off, as you grab the switch, a model gets turned on and it looks like you're actually grabbing the hand, and just to give you a bit of visual feedback and make you feel like you're more part of the VR world. In order to get your hand manipulated around this switch, you can use your VR hands, and you would use the same model as you do for your actual VR hand, and grab hold of the prefab and drag in the right hand model. So you've got your right hand model here, and the first thing you're going to want to do is right click on it and go prefab, unpack completely, and then remove the improved hand controller script. So all you've got here is just a 3D model that's a replica of your VR hand, and then you want to move it into position like so and position it and use the bones on the hand and mold it around the thing you want to try and grab. So it takes a little bit of placement and finesse. I'm going to time lapse this so you guys don't have to sit here for hours watching me move bones. Then once you are happy with the position of your hand and how you've modeled it around your little lever, you can go ahead and drag the right hand model into the switch box puzzle, anywhere like that. And then where you have your rotator script, just go ahead and say tick the box, should use dummy hands, and drag in your models. For now I've only got the right hand model. I go ahead and I can drag it in the right hand model. And then once it's in, just turn it off. And then once you've got it turned off, go ahead and drag it inside the switch box. The object will actually going to rotate dial joint right on my model here. You can see as this moves, my hand needs to move as well. Just make sure it's in the right place in the hierarchy. And then we'll go ahead and test it out. So back in VR. So now we'll see that as I go ahead and I grab this, my actual VR hand gets turned off and this model gets turned on, which, you know, it looks like nothing has happened, but it really has. And then I'm able to grab this and turn, and you can see my model turns along with my hand, making this light go up and down. It goes from off, and we go rotate, 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 and then it gets to the maximum value, and then it'll go off again, and then increase as we go around. That's working great, and you can do the same for the left and the right, and then just take your hand away, and you're back to your normal hands again. And that creates a seamless result, and it looks very convincing. So you don't actually know that you're using a dummy hand. And I don't know whether that's like the right way to do it or not. I mean, you could probably go down the route of creating custom poses. But for me, in terms of speed and ease, I think that's probably the way I'll go for a minute. But let me know what you guys think. Well, there we go. That was a bit of a massive video, but hopefully you enjoyed it and learned something. And don't forget, you can download the rotator script along with the prefab that we made for setting up an actual switch. Hopefully you'll be able to use that to create your own cool interactions. But we've actually done a lot of different kind of XR interactions, and I think it's time we had a look at actually making a game using the XR interaction toolkit from start to finish. So stay subscribed, and more videos coming soon. See you then.